Tonight, I am going to tell you a story about a man who came back from war and never really found his way home. His name was Lawrence Miller. He had survived everything that should have killed him, yet somehow what waited in peace was harder to survive than the war itself. In the spring of 1950, a humid haze hung over New Orleans. The air smelled of rain, gasoline, and magnolia flowers that never seemed to bloom completely. Lawrence stepped off the train carrying a small suitcase, his army jacket folded carefully under his arm. He hadn't been home in nearly a decade. The streets looked the same in outline but wrong in color, faded, distorted, as if the whole city had aged while he wasn't looking. He walked slowly down Magnolia Street, past wooden houses that leaned toward the pavement, past porches filled with the slow rhythm of ceiling fans and cigarette smoke. When he reached the corner where his family's house stood, he stopped. The building looked smaller than his memory allowed. The porch sagged, one shutter dangled loose, and ivy had crept up the front steps like it was trying to claim what the years had forgotten. For several minutes he simply watched the house, unsure whether to enter. He had imagined this moment every night since the hospital, but in his imagination, there had always been someone waiting at the door. His sister, a neighbor, a familiar voice calling his name. The silence that greeted him now felt almost personal. When he finally opened the door, the smell of dust and wood rot rolled out to meet him. Inside, the air was thick and unmoving, as though the rooms had been holding their breath. A radio sat on the table beside an ashtray full of gray flakes. Lawrence turned the knob. A burst of static filled the room, then a voice, faint, formal, distant. Authorities are still investigating the recent deaths in the St. Claude district. He switched it off. The silence returned, deeper now. He set his suitcase by the wall, took off his hat, and sat in the nearest chair. The wood creaked. The street outside had quieted. Somewhere far away, a trumpet played a broken line of jazz that never quite resolved into melody. He listened to it for a long time, until it felt like the music was breathing with him. That night, sleep refused him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of blinding light, heard the metallic slam of tank doors, the short bark of orders shouted across fields. When the thunder started after midnight, his body tensed before his mind could tell him it was only weather. He rose, lit a cigarette, and watched the orange tip glow in the dark. At around 3 a.m., he heard something move in the hallway, slow, deliberate steps across the wooden floor. He froze, listening. The footsteps stopped outside his door. The room seemed to shrink. Even the air felt thicker. He whispered, "Who's there?" No answer. The only sound was the steady tick of the wall clock, marking seconds that stretched too long. He turned on the lamp, stood and opened the door. The hallway was empty. Dust swirled in the lamplight. On the floor, faint impressions of bare feet led halfway down the corridor and disappeared. He stared at them until the flame of his cigarette burned down to his fingers. In the morning, he convinced himself it had been a trick of the light. The mind, he told himself, hears what it wants when it's alone too long. Still, he wrote the incident in a small notebook he carried everywhere. The writing steadied him. April 15th, 1950, footsteps at night, no intruder found. He spent the next day walking the neighborhood. The people looked different, younger, cautious, polite in a way that kept distance. The shop on the corner where he used to buy coffee had changed hands. The owner, a tall man with a straw hat, watched him from behind the counter but said nothing. Lawrence bought a cup, paid with coins that left a green stain on his palm, and stood outside drinking it while the city moved around him as if he weren't there. At the docks, he asked about work. The foreman shook his head. "We're full up, mister. Maybe next month." The same answer he'd heard before, spoken with the same hollow tone of dismissal. He nodded, thanked the man, and left. The day was hot, the kind of heat that pressed down until breathing felt like labor. By dusk, he found himself in front of a small bar, the kind that never fully closed. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and brass music. For a brief moment, he thought he recognized the tune, "When the Saints Go Marching In." He smiled, the first genuine smile in months, and stepped inside. The music stopped mid-phrase. A few men at the counter turned to look at him. The bartender, a young white man polishing a glass, said quietly, "Sorry, sir, we're closing early." Lawrence checked the clock behind him. 8:45. He nodded once and walked back into the night. The rain had started again, thin and steady. Street lamps cast long pale reflections on the wet pavement. In the glow he saw his own reflection in a puddle, older, lined, eyes that never seemed to focus on the same point twice. He crouched, touched the water and whispered, "You made it back." The reflection rippled and broke apart. He reached home drenched. The radio was still silent on the table. He dried his hands, sat in the chair, and listened to the rhythm of the storm. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn cried out, one long note, fading. He picked up his notebook again. April 16th, thunder, voices in the rain. Heard my name once, maybe memory, maybe wind. Days began to fold into one another. He woke at noon, walked the streets, came home after dark. He ate little, mostly bread and coffee. Sometimes he forgot to lock the door. The city outside pulsed with life, laughter, arguments, songs, yet none of it reached him. He existed beside it, like a photograph that no longer matches the moment it was taken. On the fourth night, he dreamed of the river. In the dream, he was standing knee-deep in the Mississippi, the current pulling gently at his legs. Something heavy floated past, not a body exactly, but something shaped like one. When he woke, the room was full of dawn light, and for a moment he didn't know where he was. The neighbors started noticing him then. A woman named Ruth Elder, who lived 2 houses down, told her friends that the lights in his house never went off. A boy delivering milk said he heard voices through the window, a low conversation that never paused long enough for another person to answer. The stories spread easily, they always do. By the end of the week, most of Magnolia Street had decided that the man who came back from the war wasn't IT quite right. On the 7th evening, 2 policemen knocked on his door. Someone had called about shouting. Lawrence opened the door in his undershirt, cigarette between his fingers, eyes red from sleeplessness. The older officer asked if everything was all right. Lawrence said, "Yes, sir. Just hard to tell the dream from the day sometimes." The officer looked past him into the dim hallway, saw nothing, and nodded. "Try to get some rest, Mr. Miller." When they left, Lawrence watched their car until its lights disappeared around the corner. That night he sat on the porch, smoking. The rain had stopped, but the smell of wet wood lingered. Across the street, a radio played softly, a preacher's voice talking about forgiveness. Lawrence listened, then whispered, "And what if you don't want it?" He looked up at the stars, dim behind the haze, and felt the weight of everything he couldn't explain pressing down like the humidity itself. Somewhere inside the house, the floorboards creaked again, slow and familiar. He didn't move. He just listened until the sound faded. Later he wrote one more line in his notebook. "Home is supposed to heal you. Maybe it only remembers what broke you first." People who lived on Magnolia Street would remember him. The quiet man who came back from the war, who talked softly to himself on warm nights and never seemed to sleep. Most said he was harmless. A few weren't so sure. But everyone agreed on one thing. After Lawrence Miller returned, the street never felt the same again. And that's where his story begins. By the second week, the rhythm of the city began to seep into Lawrence's days like water through cracked stone. Morning came later each time, sunlight filtering through thin curtains and painting lines across the floorboards. Outside, the streetcar bell rang faintly. The call of vendors drifted up from the corner, and a dog barked with the persistence of someone trying not to be forgotten. He started walking toward the tram quarter, where the air carried the mixed scent of coffee, tobacco, and river mud. It was the oldest part of the city, and somehow the most alive. Brass bands practiced in courtyards behind iron gates. Children chased one another through the narrow streets, and women leaned out of windows, hanging laundry that shimmered in the heat. The neighborhood hummed with small sounds of endurance, the clatter of dishes, the sigh of ceiling fans, a radio playing soft blues from someone's kitchen. Lawrence felt invisible there, which was a kind of comfort. He'd stopped by a corner cafe where the owner, a broad-shouldered man named Henry, poured coffee without asking questions. Henry would nod toward him, no smile, just acknowledgement. Lawrence liked that. Words had grown heavy for him. Silence was easier to carry. Some days he helped sweep the sidewalk or move crates of soda bottles. Henry slipped him a sandwich, always the same. Ham, mustard, white bread. It wasn't charity, just an exchange. Work for quiet company. At noon, when the street buzzed with customers, Lawrence would sit outside watching the patterns of light on the wet pavement and think about how far sound travels before it fades. He began noticing small details that others ignored. The way the streetcar rails glinted like ribbons of heat, the cracked plaster faces on old buildings, the rhythm of distant footsteps that always seemed to echo one beat too late. At times, he caught himself counting those steps as if they might add up to something that made sense. One afternoon, while resting under an awning during a sudden rain, a woman approached him. She was carrying a paper bag and a bright red umbrella. "You live up on Magnolia?" she asked. Her voice was calm, careful. He nodded. She said her name was Miss Ruth, a friend of the elder family, and that she'd seen him walking alone most days. "You doing all right, Mr. Miller?" she asked. He hesitated before answering, trying to be. She studied him for a moment, the rain pattering softly between them. Sometimes trying is the best a man can do. Then she handed him the umbrella and kept walking. He never saw her again, but for days afterward the umbrella leaned against his wall like a silent reminder that someone had noticed. Nights remained uneasy. He'd hear faint music drifting from the quarter, trumpets, laughter, the occasional shout. Yet within his house, the air stayed still. The old clock marked the hours, each tick a quiet accusation. He kept writing in his notebook, the entries growing longer, less precise. April 23rd, same footsteps. Possible dream. Heard humming near kitchen. Could be wind. Sometimes he left the lamp on, just to prove to himself that the shadows had edges. The light created a small island in the room, a circle he trusted. Outside it, the house felt wide and watchful. He told himself these were memories echoing through old wood. Still, when the boards creaked behind him, he would stop breathing until the sound died. On Sundays, he went to church, not for faith, but for pattern. The voices of the choir rose and fell like tide water, and for brief moments he could almost believe he belonged among them. The preacher spoke of redemption, of returning home to find peace. Lawrence kept his head down, hands clasped, repeating the words silently. Find peace, find peace. But when the congregation sang, he mouthed the lyrics without sound. After the service, some of the men gathered on the steps, talking about jobs, families, politics. One of them, a retired dock worker named Reuben James, recognized him from years ago. "Miller, that you?" "Lord, I thought you'd gone for good." Lawrence smiled faintly. "Guess I did." Reuben clapped him on the shoulder. "You ever need a place to talk, you come by. I know what it's like to bring the noise home with you." Lawrence nodded, grateful, though he never went. Days folded gently, marked only by weather and radio chatter. The city seemed to move forward without him, yet it carried him along like driftwood. Sometimes he'd stand by the riverfront and watch barges slide past, their engines humming low and steady. He'd imagine his thoughts floating away with them, the confusion, the flashes of sound that didn't belong to the present. But when he turned back toward the streets, the same heaviness waited for him, quiet and patient. One humid evening, while closing the cafe, Henri mentioned that the police were looking into a break-in near the quarter. "Strange thing," he said. "Nothing stolen. Just furniture moved, doors open. Folks getting spooked." Lawrence nodded absently. He thought of his own door, which he sometimes forgot to latch. "City's restless," Henri muttered. "People hear things they don't understand." Lawrence thought he understood perfectly. That night he couldn't bring himself to go inside. He sat on the porch until dawn, listening to insects buzz in the damp air. Around 4 a.m., a faint melody drifted down the street, a trumpet practicing alone somewhere far away, playing slow, mournful notes. The tune was almost familiar, something he might have heard overseas, though he couldn't place it. He whispered the rhythm under his breath until it faded. The next morning he awoke to find the notebook open on the table, though he couldn't remember leaving it there. The latest line read, "April 26th. Heard my name from the river." The handwriting was his, but rushed, the ink uneven. He stared at the page for a long time, trying to recall the moment, then closed the cover and slipped it into his pocket. As the days grew warmer, the boundary between dream and waking began to thin. He'd walk through the quarter and feel as if the streets were repeating themselves. The same child chasing a hoop, the same dog barking near the same fence. Once he asked Henri if the cafe had always been painted green, always been blue. Henri said, puzzled. Lawrence looked again. The wall was blue. He didn't mention it again. By May 1st, the air was heavy enough to taste. He spent that evening writing without purpose, filling pages with fragments, overheard words, remembered faces, bits of dialogue from places that no longer existed. His handwriting drifted across the paper like the sound of someone speaking in another room. When he finished, he tore the pages out, folded them neatly, and placed them inside a tin box beneath the floorboard. A few nights later, a knock came at his door. Not the sharp rap of the police, but a softer rhythm, as if the visitor wasn't sure they were welcome. He opened it to find Reuben James, hat in hand. "Didn't mean to bother you, brother," Reuben said. "I was just passing by. Thought you might want company." Lawrence hesitated, then stepped aside. They sat on the porch, sharing a bottle of cola. Reuben talked about his days on the docks, about the changes in the city, new faces, old habits. Lawrence listened more than he spoke. When the conversation turned to the war, Reuben's tone softened. "You ever dream you're still there?" he asked. Lawrence nodded slowly. "Sometimes I wake up and don't know which life is the dream." Reuben looked away. "That's the hardest part, man. Coming home and realizing it's never quite home again." After Reuben left, Lawrence remained on the porch long into the night. The street was empty except for the flicker of moths around the lamp. Somewhere deep inside the house, something shifted. Not a sound, more like the sense of weight moving. He exhaled, stood, and whispered to the quiet, "You can stay if you want. Just don't wake me." He slept lightly, dreaming of the quarter again, the narrow alleys, the brass band warming up, Henri sweeping the cafe floor. In the dream, everyone moved backward, retracing their steps. When he woke, the morning light felt foreign, as though it had traveled too far to reach him. He decided to take a train out of town, just for a day. The conductor barely looked at him when he bought the ticket. The train rolled north through fields glistening with dew. He watched the landscape change, the slow rhythm of trees, the flash of sunlight on water. For the first time in months, he felt distance. But by evening, he was back in the city, drawn as if the streets themselves were calling him home. The house smelled of rain again. He left the door open and sat down, listening to the creak of the walls. The notebook lay on the table, blank page ready. He wrote, May 8th. It's quiet tonight. Maybe that's enough. He closed the book and leaned back. Outside, the first notes of a trumpet rose from the quarter. Slow, careful, human. It sounded almost like forgiveness, though he wasn't sure for whom. By early June, New Orleans had settled into that heavy kind of summer that felt less like weather and more like a test of endurance. The air was thick, unhurried, and it carried every sound as if the city were made of brass. Even the flies moved slowly, circling the sweet rot that rose from the riverbanks. Lawrence Miller woke each morning to the same half-light and the same stillness that filled his house like fog. The wallpaper had begun to peel near the corners, curling into delicate shapes that reminded him of maps. He'd trace them with his eyes, following imaginary rivers to nowhere, until the clock told him it was time to move. The days had become routines, stitched together with silence. He would shave, put on a clean shirt, and walk to the quarter. Henri's Cafe was still there, always there, the steady heartbeat of a neighborhood that seemed to shift only in color and temperature. Henri never asked how Lawrence was doing anymore. He'd simply slide a cup of coffee across the counter and say, "Morning." That one word was enough to remind Lawrence that the world was still turning. Outside, the streetcar rattled past. Children chased one another between the rails, their laughter high and bright. He found himself smiling sometimes, small, brief smiles that disappeared before anyone could see. Then, when the laughter faded, the quiet would come rushing back, as if the sound itself had been holding it at bay. He began walking longer distances, past the quarter, and down toward Elysian Fields Avenue, where the city felt older, forgotten. Buildings leaned into one another, their bricks eroded by decades of rain and indifference. There he found a small second-hand bookstore run by a man named Mr. Calloway, who spoke so softly that every sentence felt like a secret. Lawrence bought a book on the history of Louisiana just to have something to read at night. When he turned the pages, the sound of paper reminded him of footsteps on dry ground. In that book, he found a map of the city printed in 1894. He studied it like scripture, tracing streets that no longer existed, canals that had been filled, neighborhoods erased by flood or progress. He began marking his own paths through the modern city, small dots and notes in the margins. Henri's Cafe, the church, the river. It felt like proof that he was still here, still moving, still real. Yet the nights undid him. They always did. He'd lie awake and feel the air thicken, the walls expand, as though the house itself were breathing. Sometimes he thought he heard the echo of footsteps again. Slow even, not menacing, just persistent. Other times, faint whispers that might have been the wind finding its way through cracks in the wood. Once he heard his own name in the sound of rain on the roof, drawn out and low. He told himself it was memory. Memory had its own kind of weather, unpredictable, drifting through without warning. Some days it rained inside him, other days nothing. He began to write letters he never sent. To his sister, long gone north to Chicago. To an army friend he hadn't spoken to since the hospital. To no one in particular. "The city sounds the same," one letter read, "but I can't find where it begins or ends. Sometimes I think I'm walking in circles and the street just keeps changing its name." By mid-month, the rumors in the neighborhood had softened into habit. The man on Magnolia who talked to himself. The one who walked at night and watched the river like it owed him an answer. But Lawrence didn't mind. There was freedom in being forgotten. One afternoon, he visited the church again. The preacher's voice rolled like distant thunder, the same words of mercy and restoration. Lawrence sat near the back, his hat in his hands. He noticed how the sunlight fell through the stained glass, painting the floor in reds and blues that shifted as clouds passed overhead. He found himself whispering the lines of the hymn, barely audible. When it ended, he stayed seated until the church emptied. A young boy no older than 10 stopped beside him. "Mister, you dropped this," he said, holding up a folded piece of paper. Lawrence took it, smiled, and said thank you. When the boy ran off, he opened the paper. It was one of his own letters, somehow left behind, though he couldn't remember carrying it. On the page, the ink had bled in small circles, as if touched by rain. He folded it carefully and placed it back in his coat pocket. That evening, the heat broke. Thunder rolled over the city, and rain fell with a sound like static. He stood on his porch, watching the drops blur the world into motion. For a moment he thought he saw a figure across the street, a woman with an umbrella, red like the one Miss Ruth had given him. She paused beneath a lamppost, then vanished between flashes of lightning. He stayed there until the rain stopped, his clothes clinging to him, the smell of wet earth sharp in his lungs. Inside, the clock had stopped ticking. He didn't wind it again. Days later, he went back to the bookstore. Mr. Calloway looked up from his counter and said, "You keeping well, Mr. Miller?" Lawrence nodded, just trying to remember what quiet used to sound like. Calloway smiled faintly. Sometimes quiet's the loudest thing there is. Lawrence lingered there, reading fragments of old newspapers, headlines about storms, parades, missing persons, always the same cycle of disappearance and recovery. The paper crumbled slightly under his fingers, brittle from age. He imagined his own story printed one day, not for what he'd done, but for the simple fact of having existed in a city that forgot easily. By August, the heat returned, heavier than before. The nights carried a new kind of sound, less familiar, more restless. From his porch, he could hear the quarter alive again, trumpets echoing off wet brick, voices rising with laughter and argument. He began to imagine the city as a living thing, breathing, sighing, keeping secrets. Sometimes he thought it was talking to him. "You came back," it seemed to say. "Now stay long enough to listen." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. That week, Reuben stopped by again, bringing a loaf of bread from the church kitchen. "You still keeping notes?" he asked. Lawrence nodded and tapped the notebook in his pocket. "Good," Reuben said. "It helps. Even when it don't make sense. Write it down." That night, Lawrence opened the notebook and began a new entry. August 3rd. Sound of river stronger tonight. Smells of rust and rain. Thought I heard someone call from below the levee. Maybe dream. Maybe memory. He paused, staring at the ink, then added, "Feels like something's waiting, but I don't know if it's mine or the city's." When he put down the pen, the silence felt almost alive, like a breath drawn in, not yet released. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long while, let the quiet fill him without fear. The clock began ticking again, somewhere behind him. By late August, New Orleans had fallen into a rhythm that only those who lived there long enough could hear. The days burned and shimmered, the nights opened like damp envelopes filled with the sound of insects and jazz. For Lawrence Miller, the city had stopped being a place and had become something closer to a companion. Patient, wordless, watching. He no longer kept to the same routes. Some mornings he walked aimlessly, letting the streets choose for him. He would turn corners without thinking and find himself in neighborhoods he didn't remember ever seeing. The air would shift slightly, cooler here, heavier there, and he'd think, the city's breathing. Sometimes he imagined that if he moved in the right pattern long enough, he'd reach the center of it. Not a physical center, but a point of stillness, the heart of its quiet. He kept his notebook with him always. The entries had grown less factual, more like conversations. The river hums when the sun rises. The streets remember footsteps even after rain. Some walls echo longer than others. There was no plan to the writing anymore, only instinct. When he read back through it, the words didn't sound like his. Henri noticed the change first. "You walk like a man looking for something," he said one morning while wiping the counter. Lawrence smiled faintly. "Maybe I am." Henri nodded. "Just don't forget to look up once in a while. City likes to keep her eyes above you." Lawrence didn't answer. He wasn't sure if it was advice or warning. The quarter had begun to change subtly. New faces in the cafes. Old storefronts shuttered without notice. At night, the music drifted differently. Same notes, but softer, slower, as though played from another block away. He wondered if anyone else noticed. When he asked Henri about it, the man just shrugged. "Same as it ever was," he said. But Lawrence wasn't convinced. He started visiting the river more often. It had become his place of confession, the only place where sound didn't press against him. Standing by the water, he could feel the pulse of the current beneath the surface, the deep vibration that reminded him of engines, or maybe of his own heartbeat. He dropped pebbles into the dark and listened for how long they took to vanish. One afternoon, a stranger approached him there. An older woman dressed neatly, carrying a basket of flowers. She set the basket down and said, "You're Lawrence Miller." It wasn't a question. He nodded slowly. She looked at him for a long moment before speaking again. "My brother served with you. Said you played trumpet once." He hadn't thought about that in years. The horn was still in a case somewhere, under his bed. "That was a long time ago," he said. She smiled. "Music doesn't forget, even when we do." When she left, she placed a single white flower on the railing beside him. He stood there long after she was gone, staring at the petals trembling in the wind. That night, he found the trumpet case. It was dust-covered, the hinges stiff. When he lifted the instrument, the smell of brass and old velvet filled the room. He pressed the mouthpiece to his lips and exhaled, but no sound came, only air, trembling. He tried again, and a faint note escaped, fragile as glass. It startled him. The sound seemed to hang in the room longer than it should have, bouncing off the walls like something alive. He lowered the trumpet and whispered, "I remember." For days after, he carried the horn with him but never played. Just the weight of it in his hands felt like proof that he had once belonged to something larger than silence. The city responded. At least, it felt that way. Every time he passed through tram, someone would be humming a melody he almost recognized. A woman hanging laundry, a boy on a stoop tapping rhythm on a crate. The notes followed him, weaving through alleys and side streets. He told himself it was coincidence, but deep down, he wondered if the city was echoing him, repeating what he hadn't yet said out loud. At the cafe, Henri teased him gently. "You look like a man with a secret." Lawrence smiled. "Maybe I'm remembering how to listen." Henri nodded thoughtfully. "Careful with that. Some things you hear don't stop talking." As September approached, the storms came more often. Rain blurred the world until it seemed made of reflections. Lawrence loved those nights best. The sound of thunder mixed with the distant horns from the quarter, a low dialogue between sky and city. He would sit by the window, trumpet across his knees, and imagine the music rising through the rain, connecting every lonely sound into something whole. One evening, he walked to the church during a downpour. The doors were unlocked, the candles unlit. Inside, the air was cool, carrying the smell of wax and damp wood. He sat in the back pew and listened to the roof groan with the storm. The sound was deep and slow, almost like breathing. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he wasn't sure how much time had passed. The rain had stopped. Moonlight spilled across the floor, pale and silvery. Somewhere outside, water dripped in a steady rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. He thought of his notebook and all the words inside it. The way they recorded not just his life, but the city's moods. Maybe they weren't so different after all. Both built on memory, both full of echoes. As he walked home, he realized the streets were empty but not silent. The hum of power lines, the faint music from far-off bars, the whisper of his own shoes on wet pavement. Together they made a kind of symphony. He slowed his pace to match it, each step deliberate, in time with the city's unseen rhythm. Back in his house, he opened the notebook and wrote without thinking. September 10th. The city listens now. When I breathe, she breathes. When I stop, she waits. He looked at the words for a long moment, then closed the book and placed it beside the trumpet. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat on the porch, watching dawn lift over the rooftops, the light soft and gold. For the first time in months, he felt something close to calm. Not peace exactly, but the quiet understanding that he and the city were no longer separate. When the first streetcar bell rang, he smiled, and somewhere faintly from deep within the quarter, a trumpet answered. By October, New Orleans was breathing differently. The air had cooled, and the heavy, unbroken heat of summer gave way to mornings with a thin mist that clung to the river like smoke. The city's noise softened, less shouting, less brass, more footsteps. For the first time in months, Lawrence Miller could hear himself think without the hum of the world pressing against him. He spent his mornings at the cafe as always, but he had stopped ordering coffee. Henry would bring it anyway, set the cup down, and nod. "You look better," he said once. Lawrence didn't answer. He wasn't sure if better was the right word. Maybe just quieter. He had started walking with a purpose again. Each street carried a memory, and each turn seemed to test whether he could still find his way back. The notebook in his pocket grew heavier with ink. He'd written so much that some pages had begun to tear near the spine. His handwriting had changed too, smaller, more deliberate, like he was trying to take up less space on the page. October 4th. The city hums low now, like a record at half speed. Streetcars sound tired. I think it's resting or waiting. He reread that line often. The idea of a city waiting intrigued him. Waiting for what? For him to move again? For something to happen? He didn't know, but the thought made him careful, as if every step mattered. One afternoon, while walking near the edge of the quarter, he heard music. Not from the bars or the clubs, but from somewhere above. A lone trumpet drifting down from an open window. The melody was simple, slow, but it carried weight, the kind that filled the air long after the notes had ended. He stood on the sidewalk listening until the song stopped. When he looked up, the window was empty. That night he wrote in his notebook, October 9th, someone else remembers. The sound found me first. He started hearing that trumpet more often. Sometimes at dawn, sometimes deep in the night. Never the same tune, but always the same distance. Close enough to feel, too far to trace. He began timing it, marking the hours in his notebook, sketching small maps with arrows and guesses. He thought maybe it was coming from the river, or from the rooftops, or from the city itself. Henry noticed the change again. "You listening for ghosts, Lawrence?" he asked one morning with a grin. "Not ghosts," Lawrence said. "Just something that doesn't want to be lost." Henry shrugged. "Same thing some days." At the bookstore, Mr. Calloway handed him a stack of yellowed newspapers. "Thought you might like these," he said. "Old issues from before the war. City looked different then." Lawrence took them home, spent the evening unfolding the pages carefully. The print smelled of dust and old ink. He read names of businesses long gone, parades that no one remembered, stories about floods and fires. On one page, a headline caught his eye. Local musician missing after river storm. There was no photograph, just a short paragraph about a man who had disappeared in 1933. Lawrence stared at the words. The name didn't mean anything to him, but the description, a trumpeter known in the quarter, made his breath catch for a moment. He folded the page and slipped it into his notebook. That night, the trumpet played again. Louder this time, closer. He stood on his porch, eyes scanning the dark street. The sound floated through the air, slow, mournful, like a conversation he'd half forgotten. He raised his hand slightly, as if to answer. The music stopped mid-note. He didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, the world looked the same, but something had shifted. The light came in softer, slower. The clock ticked irregularly, like it too was thinking. He walked to the river, and for the first time, it felt smaller, as if the city had folded in on itself overnight. Even the water moved differently, curling toward the banks with a quiet that wasn't peace, but restraint. At the cafe, Henri was cleaning glasses. "You hear that storm last night?" "There was no storm," Lawrence said. Henri looked at him strangely. "Sure there was. Woke me up around 2. Lawrence said nothing. He had been awake at 2. He had heard no rain, only the trumpet. He walked home slower that day, his reflection following him in every window. He thought about how cities changed, not through destruction, but through forgetting. Whole buildings erased, names repainted, stories rewritten. Maybe the city wasn't waiting for something new. Maybe it was remembering something old. That evening, he opened the folded newspaper page again. The missing musician's name was Elias Reed. The article said he used to play near the river on Saturday nights. He checked the date, exactly 17 years ago that week. He read it twice, then 3 times before putting it away. In his notebook, he wrote, October 15th, "The city keeps what it loses. Sometimes it plays it back." That night, the trumpet returned. The same slow tune, the same familiar distance. But this time, he realized something. The melody matched one of his own from years ago, a song he'd written during the war, before the hospital, before the quiet took over. He stood still, the sound threading through the humid air, wrapping around him like breath. He didn't move until the last note faded. When he finally turned back toward his house, he felt a strange calm. The city wasn't haunting him, he thought. It was reminding him. The echoes weren't warnings. They were memory taking shape, refusing to disappear. Later, before bed, he wrote his final note of the night. October 16th. The city remembers for us when we can tea. Maybe that's all we ever ask of it. He closed the notebook and listened for the river. For once it was silent, not empty, just listening back. By November, the air in New Orleans had turned cool and clear, the kind that carried every sound cleanly across the streets. The rain had stopped for weeks, and the river ran smooth, heavy with light. The city seemed to pause, not asleep, not awake, but listening. Lawrence Miller woke early each morning before sunrise. The quiet had become part of him, like another pulse beneath the skin. The notebook lay open beside his bed, a map of thoughts, notes, half-sentences. He no longer dated his entries. There was no need. Time had stopped feeling linear. He had begun to play again. Only at night, only when the street was still. At first it was just a few hesitant notes, but gradually the sound grew steadier. The trumpet's voice returned like an old friend, rough around the edges, but honest. The neighbors didn't complain. Some nights, someone clapped from a distant window. Other nights, the city itself seemed to hum in time. November 3rd. Sound feels solid now, like something I can hold. Maybe that's what it always was. The cafe remained the same. Henri's laugh, the smell of chicory, the clatter of spoons. Yet everything felt softer, lighter, as though the world had exhaled. Lawrence no longer sat in the corner. He took a seat by the window instead, where he could watch the streetcars roll past. Henry would sometimes glance over and smile. "You're finding your rhythm again, old friend." Lawrence nodded. "Maybe the city just slowed down enough for me to catch up." In the afternoons, he walked the same streets he had wandered for months, but now they seemed familiar, not haunting. The boarded buildings, the fading paint, the quiet stoops, they were all part of a single rhythm, imperfect but whole. He stopped searching for the trumpet that had once played in the distance. He realized it no longer needed to. At the bookstore, Mr. Calloway handed him a record wrapped in brown paper. "Found this in a box of donations," he said. "Thought you'd appreciate it." Lawrence unwrapped it slowly. The label was faded, the grooves worn, but the title was still legible. Elias Reed and his band, River's Lament. The name hit him softly. He nodded, almost to himself. "Thank you," he said. That night, he brought out his old gramophone. The machine sputtered before catching rhythm, the needle crackling across the surface. Then the music came, the same slow, mournful trumpet he had heard for months. The melody moved through the air like breath, deep and steady, and Lawrence felt the room expand with it. He sat still, listening. Every note seemed to know where it had been before, floating between memory and present, between what was lost and what remained. When the record ended, he didn't lift the needle right away. The static that followed was soft, almost like rain. He smiled faintly. "So that's where you were," he whispered. The next morning, he carried the trumpet down to the river. The air smelled faintly of salt and rust. The water caught the early light, silver and gold. He stood at the railing, his hands resting on the cool metal, and watched the current move, not rushing, not stalling, just flowing as it always had. He lifted the trumpet and played, not loud, not for anyone to hear, just a few notes, enough to let the sound drift over the water. It wasn't a song, more like a conversation, one side spoken in brass, the other in wind. When he finished, he lowered the instrument and listened. The city didn't answer. It didn't need to. That evening, he wrote his final note in the notebook. November 10th. The river remembers. The city keeps its promises. I think that's enough. He left the notebook on his table beside the gramophone. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one, the city's heartbeat steady and slow. Somewhere far away, a trumpet played faintly, the same melody carried forward, belonging now to someone else. Lawrence sat on his porch, watching the lights shimmer across the damp pavement. The sound of the streetcar rolled through the night, the same rhythm that had always been there, the same quiet song the city had never stopped singing. He smiled once more, closed his eyes, and let the evening settle around him. The city listened, as it always did, and for the first time, Lawrence felt completely understood.